Yo guys, Virtual Nate is making another video about Debian? Well, there's no surprise that I'm making this video given what I did earlier. Hi. This video is overdue and I recently gained a bunch of new subscribers, so we need some context. Almost 2 months ago, I uploaded a video entitled Upgrading from Debian 1.1 to Debian 13. Some of y'all have seen at least the time-lapse, but what I didn't explain was that that video took 10.5 hours to record. I sped up the video 92 times to get it down to 7 minutes and match the music I was using, but also, I did not explain my methodology. Upgrading Debian is not nearly as simple as upgrading Windows, so it's time to explain how I did it. First, I need to explain the setup. I ran the VM on qemu/kvm with the virt manager front end on Debian 13. Since I would install Debian 1.1 with floppy disk images, I had to tell virt manager to do a manual install. I gave the VM 256 megabytes of RAM to start with, expanding it to 4 gigabytes later on, and I created a 32 gigabyte hard disk for it. I added a CD-ROM drive to install standard packages and do the upgrades between early versions, and a floppy drive to install Debian 1.1. I wanted internet access as early as possible, so I set the network card to the RTL8139. With that setup in mind, the upgrade saga begins. Installing Debian 1.1, codenamed Buzz, was simple enough for me. However, I needed to pay careful attention to my partition layout. First, I created a 10 megabyte partition to use for booting the system, because in this version of Debian, the bootloader does not support installation beyond the first gigabyte of a hard disk. Next, I created a swap partition. It was very important that I placed it before the root partition so that I could expand the root partition later. Finally, I created the root partition. You might assume that I would go for the maximum possible size right away, but it doesn't work like that. For one, this version of Debian can't read or write past the first 8 gigabytes of a disk. But more importantly, there's an overflow bug in this version which prevents the creation of ext2 file systems larger than 2 gigabytes in size. So for the time being, I created a 1 gigabyte root partition. From there, I followed the installation procedure as normal and chose not to create a boot floppy. Now after some user configuration, we have to deal with the abomination that is deselect. The first thing I do is hold the kernel image package because it's broken and doesn't install correctly. Then I try to install sudo, which as I later found out is also broken. But that's okay, as we still have a fully working system installed. Now it's time to upgrade to Debian 1.2, codenamed Rex, via deselect, and the only considerations here are to hold Perl, otherwise the upgrade will fail, and make sure the kernel is updated. I also removed latex and all of its dependencies because trying to upgrade it often makes the system hang in my experience, plus it will become obsolete later. After the first installation round, we can unhold Perl and install another required package that for some reason deselect missed. I am very thankful for apt. Upgrading to Debian 1.3, codenamed Bo, is a little easier, but it still doesn't quite get everything the first time. For this, I just need to replace man with mandb, remove the old text packages, and install the new tetx packages, which will also upgrade packages that weren't upgraded the first time around. Oh, and for some reason, PPP is broken too, so I removed it. With the upgrade to Debian 2.0, codenamed Ham, comes our first major transition, the transition from libc5, the Linux C library, to libc6, the GNU C library version 2.x. Deselect doesn't know how to handle this, so I have to manually upgrade libc5, LDSO, and libreadline 2 to avoid conflicts with the newer libraries used in Debian 2.0. After a reboot, I launch deselect again, but once again I have to hold Perl. I also need to remove slang 0.99.34 to allow for the installation of the newer slang 0.99.38. Wow, great package names. After this little affair though, we can set up everything again and complete the upgrade. Debian 2.1, codenamed Slink, introduces apt for the first time, and it should be very easy to tell that I was very happy to finally have access to apt. This will make all future upgrades much easier to do and require less manual intervention. Though, as you'll see later, I still had to manually intervene for some upgrades. Anyways, the developers were even kind enough to bundle a version of apt that works on previous versions of Debian on the Debian 2.1 CD to allow for easier upgrades. Nice. Thank God we don't have to deal with deselect anymore. It was also at this point that I saw the RTL8139 driver had been loaded. So I set up the internet connection, installed apt from the Debian 2.1 CD, configured its sources, and began the upgrade to Debian 2.1 via the internet. Some packages were broken, but I reran the upgrade command a couple times and that completed the upgrade. When I rebooted, I realized that setting the network information via commands doesn't persist across reboots, so I had to configure the network again. Though I would put the commands in root /rc file later, so I wouldn't have to type them in every time. Now upgrading to Debian 2.2, codename Potato, and from here on out, the upgrade procedure barely changes. Edit app sources to use the next version, run apt-get upgrade, and then run apt-get dist upgrade. So from now on, I'll only show the parts where I needed to do something extra, and something already happened. When updating the kernel, I was prompted to rename the old modules directory, so I did just that and completed the upgrade. Before upgrading to Debian 3.0, codenamed Woody, I figured it was time to expand the root partition to 32 GB. So I did a quick check with cfdisk to make sure the kernel could see the full capacity of the disk, and it did. So I rebooted to a live CD, which unfortunately is not Debian based, and expanded the root partition to the maximum size, but before I could do that I needed to increase the RAM to 1 GB. I also needed to tell Lilo, the Linux loader, to use an initial RAM disk image since it's now mandatory beginning in this version. I also found that the network wasn't working, so I reloaded the RTL8139 driver and that fixed it. Now I could actually begin the upgrade. I tried to install a DHCP client beforehand to not have to worry about setting up the internet connection manually, but I found out later that I accidentally installed a server instead of a client. Rookie mistake. From here I removed the old base package, or at least I thought I did, and began the upgrade. Later on I found out that there were some leftovers that weren't deleted, so I had to help it out a bit. I also had to upgrade a few packages separately, but that was dealt with pretty quickly. Surprisingly, nothing went wrong during the upgrade to Debian 3.1, codenamed Sarge. At this point I increased the core count to 4 cores and decided that it was time to install GNOME. But when I tried to start it up, it didn't quite work just yet. So I moved on and upgraded to Debian 4.0, codenamed Etch, where I was warned about a possible issue where users found that their X server was no longer available. So I kept that in mind and made sure to check for Xserver Xorg after upgrading and found that it was indeed installed. X11 didn't quite work after upgrading, but after finding out it was because of a missing font, I installed the corresponding font and tried starting X11 again. This time it worked, but I was missing a lot of things, so I tried to use TaskCell to install them and that didn't work. Later I found out that I could use Aptitude to finish installing GNOME, so I did that. And even afterwards I was missing a window manager. I found GNOME 2's default window manager, Sawfish, and installed it, and felt that now was the time to upgrade to Debian 5.0, codenamed Lenny. At some point I was told that I had no swap space available, and was like, wait, that's weird, I thought I created a swap partition. So I tried to enable the swap partition and found out that it was corrupted. Then I tried changing the screen resolution to a wider aspect ratio, and that was a big mistake, because upon applying the changes, the screen froze and I had to reboot. But that was no big issue, as I completed the upgrade and fully removed the old base package. Now it was time to upgrade to Debian 6.0, codenamed Squeeze, and apparently a pre-release package prevented a full release package from being installed, so I had to manually purge the old package. At this point, I was prompted to have my fstab and Lilo configuration to be monitorized automatically to use UUIDs instead of device paths, which failed due to the corrupted swap partition. I manually updated the fstab, but forgot to update the Lilo configuration before rebooting, which led to the VM not being able to boot, so I had to boot to a live CD to correct this. And while I was at it, I took this time to reformat the swap partition. Now booted to Debian 6.0, I took the time to do a little bit of cleanup work before upgrading to Debian 7, codenamed Wheezy. During the upgrade to Wheezy, DPKG started complaining about the sbin directory not being in path, so I had to edit some global shell initialization scripts to fix that and finish the upgrade. Then I found out that GNOME wasn't upgraded to GNOME 3, so I had to run Aptitude again to install GNOME 3. Then I did a bit more cleaning up before rebooting. Afterwards, I upgraded to Debian 8, codenamed Jesse. I also took the time to migrate to Grub instead of Lilo, since the latter is now obsolete. Nothing went wrong in apt, so I rebooted. But then... Yep, GNOME decided to stop working entirely. I tried changing a few things and reinstalling GNOME, but it was clear to me that GNOME just wouldn't work anymore. So I uninstalled GNOME completely and installed KDE instead. Then I upgraded to Debian 9, codenamed Stretch. And of course my streak of bad luck wouldn't continue, as now KDE stopped working. I was lost for a bit on what to do, but later I realized that it was probably because the virtual GPU wasn't supported. As a troubleshooting measure in Debian Jessie, I changed the VM's GPU to VirtIO, and now I needed to change it back to QXL. But now I could upgrade to Debian 10, codename Buster. Guess what happened next? Yep, stuff broke again. This time it was the kernel. The new kernel was too unstable to work properly, so in the meantime I stayed on kernel 4.9. I did some more cleaning up to free up some disk space, and even that required some manual intervention. But after that I upgraded to Debian 11, codename Bullseye. After the upgrade though, kernel 5.10 wasn't giving me any luck either. I didn't want to have to stay on 4.9 again, so on a whim I tried changing the CPU model, and surprisingly that fixed the stability issues. For some reason though, I couldn't change the screen resolution because it kept just setting itself back to 1024 by 768, so I had to deal with that when I upgraded to Debian 12, codename Bookworm. Now, what I'm about to show you wasn't really an issue with the upgrade, but check this shit. And then, once I rebooted...
Well, what the It's a huge cursor.
Now comes a bit more cleanup work before upgrading to Debian 13, codename Trixie. One final bit of cleaning up later, and an attempt to install a 64-bit kernel, which went poorly, and the experiment has been completed. Why did I try to install a 64-bit kernel at the very end though? Well, starting in Debian 13, and from here on out, the 32-bit x86 architecture is now considered a legacy architecture, which means that new installations will not be supported, and its only remaining purpose is to support legacy code on 64-bit x86 systems. You can still technically upgrade to these versions, but as part of the deprecation process, the official Debian repositories no longer provide kernels for 32-bit systems. This means that the only way to continue getting kernel updates is to compile the kernel from source code. But 32-bit systems are old, and only getting older. That's how time works. In fact, Debian advises against trying to upgrade to Trixie on a 32-bit x86 system, not just for the reasons I mentioned earlier, but also because those packages now require support for the SSE2 instruction set. So as memory requirements increase, sometimes beyond the 4GB limit of 32-bit systems, the year 2038 problem draws closer, and applications demand more modern instruction sets, supporting these legacy systems will only become harder in the future. In an attempt to avoid all this, I tried to install a 64-bit kernel. After all, mixed installations do exist. Even the VirtualBox website acknowledges the existence of such setups. However, KDE Plasma 6 did not like this and refused to work with this setup. So this VM is stuck on kernel 6.1 for now. At this point, you may be wondering, is it possible to convert a 32-bit OS to a 64-bit OS? Well, that's a topic for a later video. I hope I'll have something on that sometime soon. Okay, bye!